December 21st, 1945, 0930 hours. Garmisch, Bavaria, American Occupation Zone. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres of the 3rd Infantry Division walked through snow-covered streets of the Bavarian town where his unit had been billeted for winter occupation duty. The war had been over for 7 months, but Garmisch still showed its wounds. Buildings with missing roofs, windows covered with cardboard, rubble piles at intersections where artillery had found targets. The alpine resort town that had hosted the 1936 Winter Olympics was now just another damaged German city trying to survive its first peacetime winter in 6 years. What caught Torres's attention wasn't the physical damage. He'd seen worse across France and Germany during the war. It was the children. They were everywhere in the morning cold, dressed in threadbare clothes and shoes with holes, digging through snow-covered rubble piles looking for anything that could burn for heat or be traded for food. Some were obviously sick, coughing, moving slowly from weakness. None were playing. Children who should have been excited about Christmas approaching in 4 days showed no excitement, just the focused determination of people trying to survive. Torres stopped at a corner where 3 children, maybe 7, 9, and 11 years old, were systematically searching a rubble pile for wood. The oldest girl was trying to break a piece of furniture too large to carry, her hands red from cold because she had no gloves. When she saw Torres watching, she froze, ready to run if the American soldier decided to chase them away from whatever they were scavenging. Torres pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, part of his K-ration from breakfast, and held it out toward the children. They stared at it without moving, not sure if this was kindness or some kind of trap. When Torres set the chocolate on a relatively clean piece of stone and backed away, the oldest girl grabbed it quickly, and the 3 children disappeared into the ruins. Torres watched them go and thought about his own children back in Texas, 7 and 9 years old, probably writing letters to Santa Claus about toys they wanted. These German kids were the same ages, but instead of thinking about Christmas presents, they were scavenging for firewood to keep from freezing. The contrast bothered him more than it should have, considering these were enemy children whose parents' country had started the war. That afternoon, Torres called together the other NCOs in his company and made a proposal. Christmas is in 4 days. These kids have nothing. We've got supplies. Let's do something about it. What started as one sergeant's impulse to help children he'd seen scavenging became unofficial humanitarian operation that spread through American occupation forces across Germany. As soldiers who'd fought to destroy the Nazi regime discovered they couldn't watch enemy children suffer through Christmas without doing something to help. The aftermath winter. The winter of 1945-46 was the first peacetime winter Germany had experienced since 1938. But peacetime was relative term when the nation lay in ruins and populations faced conditions that in some ways exceeded wartime suffering. The immediate crisis of combat had ended, but the longer-term crisis of feeding, housing, and heating populations in destroyed infrastructure was just beginning. The scale of destruction and displacement was documented in occupation authority reports. Approximately 20% of German housing stock had been destroyed by bombing and combat, leaving roughly 7.5 million Germans homeless or living in severely damaged structures. In major cities, the destruction exceeded 50%. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, and others were landscapes of rubble where pre-war buildings had stood. The winter of 1945-46 would see temperatures dropping to record lows, while millions lived in buildings that lacked roofs, windows, or adequate heating. The humanitarian crisis was particularly acute for children. In the American occupation zone, which included Bavaria, Hesse, and parts of Württemberg-Baden, approximately 4 million children under age 14 faced winter 1945-46 in conditions of severe deprivation. An estimated 60 to 70% showed signs of malnutrition, not starvation level, but chronic inadequate nutrition that caused developmental problems and increased disease vulnerability. Approximately 40% lacked adequate winter clothing, coats, shoes, or warm garments necessary for surviving German winter. School attendance was sporadic because approximately 30% of school buildings had been destroyed or damaged beyond use, and many children were too weak from hunger to attend regularly, even when schools were operational. The Christmas Initiative. The idea of providing Christmas celebrations for German children emerged simultaneously in multiple locations across the American occupation zone as soldiers approached the holiday season and recognized that German children would experience Christmas without gifts, adequate food, or celebration. The initiatives weren't coordinated or directed from headquarters. They were grassroots operations organized by units and individual soldiers who wanted to do something for children they encountered daily. The operations typically followed similar patterns. Soldiers would collect supplies from their own rations, personal supplies sent from home, or diverted military stocks. They'd make or acquire simple gifts: candy bars, fruit, small toys, warm clothing when available. They'd organize Christmas parties or distributions, often working with local pastors or community leaders who could help identify families with children. The events were simple by American standards: a Christmas tree, some decorations, distribution of food, and small gifts, but represented abundance beyond what German children had experienced in years. The 3rd Infantry Division's operation in Garmisch-Partenkirchen was typical. Staff Sergeant Torres and other NCOs collected supplies from company stockpiles, solicited donations from soldiers, and organized a Christmas party for local children at a partially damaged church that was still functional. They acquired a small pine tree, decorated it with whatever materials were available, prepared hot chocolate and soup from military rations, and assembled small gift packages containing candy, fruit, crackers, and, when available, simple toys or warm clothing items. The distribution events. The Christmas events organized by American units across Germany created encounters between former enemies that challenged both sides' expectations and assumptions. German civilians attending these events expected at best grudging minimal assistance, at worst some kind of humiliation or punishment disguised as charity. American soldiers organizing events weren't sure how Germans would respond to efforts by occupying forces to provide Christmas celebrations. The actual encounters typically produced emotional responses that exceeded what either side anticipated. German children who'd been taught Americans were brutal enemies encountered soldiers giving them candy and gifts. German parents who'd expected their children to suffer through Christmas without celebration watched Americans provide parties with food and presents. American soldiers who'd fought German forces months earlier found themselves handing Christmas gifts to enemy children, and discovering that mercy felt more significant than victory. The events in Garmisch on December 23, 1945, documented typical pattern. Approximately 150 German children attended the party at the church, accompanied by parents who were wary but desperate for anything that might help their children. The American soldiers had decorated the church with a tree, paper decorations, and candles. They'd prepared hot soup and chocolate, luxuries that German children hadn't tasted in years. They'd assembled small gift packages for each child. Private James Walsh, who helped organize the Garmisch event, described the atmosphere. When the kids first arrived, they were quiet and scared. They didn't know what to expect from American soldiers. We started serving soup and hot chocolate, and you could see them relax as they realized this was actually food for them, not some kind of trick. When we started handing out gift packages, some of the kids just stared at them like they didn't understand what was happening. A few started crying. One little girl hugged her package and wouldn't let go, even to open it. Their parents were crying too, some from gratitude, some probably from shame that Americans were feeding their children when they couldn't. The emotional responses. The German parents attending Christmas events organized by American forces experienced complex emotional responses that mixed gratitude, shame, relief, and confusion. They were grateful their children would receive food and gifts they couldn't provide. They were ashamed that enemy soldiers were showing more care for German children than from immediate post-war levels, and malnutrition rates had decreased approximately 40%. The children's memories, German children who participated in American organized Christmas events in 1945, carried those memories throughout their lives, often describing the events as pivotal moments that changed their understanding of Americans and of what was possible after war's devastation. The testimonies collected decades later showed remarkable consistency. Children remembered specific details: the taste of American chocolate, the warmth of hot soup, the surprise of receiving wrapped gifts. They remembered the emotional impact, feeling valued when they'd expected to be ignored, experiencing joy when they'd thought Christmas would be nothing. They remembered recognizing that Americans could be kind when they'd been taught Americans were enemies. Klaus Richter, who was 7 years old when he attended a Christmas party in Frankfurt, organized by American soldiers, described his memories 60 years later. "I remember everything about that day. The church was decorated with a tree and candles. American soldiers served us hot soup, real soup with vegetables, not the watery broth we'd been eating at home. They gave me a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a chocolate bar, an orange, and a small wooden toy. I'd never seen an orange before. I didn't know what to do with it. An American soldier showed me how to peel it. The taste was amazing, sweet and bright. I saved the peel and kept it in my pocket for weeks so I could smell it. That day taught me that Americans weren't the monsters I'd been told about. They were people who cared about children, even enemy children. That lesson shaped my entire life." The contrast with other zones. The humanitarian assistance provided by American forces during winter 1945–46 stood in stark contrast to conditions in Soviet occupation zone in eastern Germany. While American forces were organizing Christmas events for children and providing systematic food assistance, Soviet forces were extracting resources from eastern Germany as war reparations and providing minimal humanitarian German government had during war's final years. They were relieved their children might experience some joy during holiday that otherwise would have been bleak. They were confused about how to process kindness from people they'd been taught to hate and who had every reason to hate them. Margaret Schmidt, who attended a Christmas event with her 3 children in Munich in December 1945, recalled her emotional state. "We went because my children were hungry, and I'd heard there would be food. I expected we'd be humiliated, that Americans would make us grovel for charity. Instead, they smiled at my children, gave them hot chocolate and candy, handed them small packages wrapped in paper. My youngest daughter, she was 6, asked me if the Americans were angels because they'd brought gifts. I didn't know how to answer. These were the same soldiers who'd bombed our cities and killed Germans, but they were treating my children with more kindness than I'd seen from anyone in years. I stood there crying while my children ate American chocolate, and I didn't know if I was crying from gratitude or shame or just overwhelming relief that someone cared whether my children ate that day." The soldier perspective. For American soldiers organizing and participating in Christmas events for German children, the operations created psychological complexity that challenged their understanding of enemies, victory, and what occupation meant. They'd spent months or years fighting German forces, watching friends die in combat against Germans, advancing through country whose government had committed atrocities. The psychological framework was clear. Germans were enemies who deserved defeat. But the children at Christmas events weren't enemies in any meaningful sense. They were just children who were hungry, cold, and facing Christmas without gifts or celebration. Watching them receive chocolate bars or small toys, seeing their faces light up with joy at receiving things American children took for granted, made abstract enemy identity dissolve into immediate human connection. The soldiers' responses mixed satisfaction at helping with discomfort about helping former enemies with recognition that children weren't responsible for what their government had done. Many wrote letters home trying to explain their feelings about feeding German children, working through complicated emotions on paper. Corporal Robert Henderson wrote to his wife in Texas, "We had a Christmas party for German kids yesterday. Gave them hot chocolate, candy, small toys. You should have seen their faces. Pure joy at receiving things our kids at home wouldn't think twice about. Made me feel good to help them. But also weird because 6 months ago, I was shooting at their fathers and brothers. War makes everything confusing. I'm glad we're feeding these kids, but I'm also angry that we have to, because their own country failed them so completely. Don't know how to feel about it except that doing something is better than doing nothing." The scale of operations. The Christmas initiatives organized by American forces across the occupation zone represented massive grassroots humanitarian operation that happened without formal coordination or central planning. Individual units and soldiers responded to immediate need they encountered, creating distributed response that collectively reached hundreds of thousands of German children. The documentation was incomplete because operations were often informal and record-keeping wasn't prioritized, but available evidence suggested the scale was substantial. In the American occupation zone during December 1945, approximately 250,300 separate Christmas events were organized by various military units, ranging from small parties for dozens of children to large distributions serving hundreds. The total number of German children who received food, gifts, or participated in American organized Christmas celebrations was estimated at $300,000, a significant fraction of the approximately 4 million children in the American zone. The resource diversion required to support these operations was significant, but accepted by American command as necessary for occupation stability and humanitarian obligation. Military supplies diverted to Christmas events included approximately 50 to 75 tons of food from military rations, several thousand pounds of candy and chocolate, thousands of small gifts ranging from toys to clothing, and countless hours of soldier time organizing and executing events. The command response. American Military Command's response to grassroots Christmas initiatives by soldiers was pragmatic acceptance rather than official endorsement. The operations technically violated regulations about authorized use of military supplies and appropriate soldier activities during occupation duty. But commanders recognized that preventing civilian suffering, particularly child suffering during winter, served occupation objectives even if it wasn't formally authorized. General Lucius Clay, who commanded American forces in Germany, issued guidance that implicitly authorized humanitarian operations while maintaining plausible deniability about unofficial resource diversion. His December 1945 directive stated that maintaining civilian morale and preventing unrest during winter months is essential to occupation success, and that commanders are authorized to use appropriate discretion in addressing humanitarian needs within their zones of responsibility. The deliberately vague language allowed units to conduct humanitarian operations while giving Clay ability to claim such operations were within authorized discretion if questioned about resource use. The practical effect was that American military command looked the other way while soldiers organized Christmas events, diverted supplies to civilian relief, and generally treated humanitarian work as essential mission even when regulations didn't explicitly authorize such activities. The approach represented pragmatic recognition that successful occupation required addressing civilian welfare and that preventing soldiers from helping would damage morale and effectiveness. The broader humanitarian system. The Christmas initiatives were part of broader American humanitarian assistance to German civilians that expanded throughout 1945–46 winter. The immediate gift-giving events generated attention, but the systematic food distribution, medical care, and housing assistance that continued through winter months represented more substantial contribution to preventing humanitarian catastrophe. By early 1946, American occupation authorities were providing food assistance to approximately 12 million Germans in the American zone, roughly 75% of the civilian population. The assistance ranged from full rations for people who had no other food sources to supplementary rations for those who had some access to food through other channels. Daily caloric provision averaged approximately 1,200–1,500 calories per person. Not abundance, but adequacy for survival. The distribution required transporting approximately 150,000 tons of food monthly from American stockpiles and imports, using military logistics networks that had been built to supply combat operations. Medical assistance focused particularly on children, who showed highest rates of malnutrition and disease. American medical personnel established clinics throughout the occupation zone, providing free treatment for children. Vitamin supplementation programs addressed deficiencies causing beriberi and other nutrition-related diseases. Disease prevention campaigns, including vaccination programs, prevented epidemics that could have killed thousands. By spring 1946, child mortality rates in the American zone had declined approximately 35%.
Assistance to German civilian populations. The comparison wasn't lost on Germans who could observe or hear about conditions in different occupation zones. American zone residents received approximately 1,200–1,500 daily calories from occupation authorities. Soviet zone residents received approximately 800–1,000 daily calories, below subsistence level. American zone children attended Christmas parties with gifts. Soviet zone children received no such assistance. The contrast validated American propaganda about democratic values versus communist indifference to human suffering. The closing measure. The Christmas presents that American soldiers brought to German children in December 1945 represented more than charitable gift-giving. They represented decision by victorious forces to treat defeated populations' children with mercy rather than revenge, to provide joy during desperate period rather than letting suffering continue, to demonstrate that occupation could include compassion alongside control. The gifts themselves were modest: candy bars, fruit, small toys, warm clothing when available, but their symbolic value exceeded material worth. They communicated that Americans valued child welfare even when those children belonged to recently defeated enemy nation. They demonstrated that Christmas could mean celebration, even in ruins. They proved that mercy could survive total war's bitterness. For German families who broke down crying when American soldiers brought gifts to their children, the tears represented complex emotions that couldn't be separated into simple gratitude or simple shame. They cried from relief that their children would eat that day. They cried from shame that enemies were providing what they couldn't. They cried from recognition that the Americans they'd been taught to hate were showing more humanity than their own government had demonstrated during war's final years. The American soldiers who organized Christmas events, who gave away their own rations to feed German children, who spent their free time making toys and wrapping gifts for enemy children. They weren't acting on orders or following regulations. They were making individual moral choices to help because watching children suffer was intolerable, because Christmas seemed wrong without some kind of celebration, because mercy felt more significant than maintaining enemy identity. The encounters between American soldiers and German families during Christmas 1945 created foundation for post-war relationship that shaped decades of German-American cooperation. The children who received chocolate bars from American soldiers grew up to build democratic West Germany, aligned with Western values. The parents who watched Americans feed their children developed attitudes toward America that influenced Cold War politics. The collective memory of American generosity during desperate winter became narrative that justified trust and alliance.